Start করবো sir?
Yeah, start karo.
Okay. A very good morning to each and everybody present on this series of webinar. Today we have with us Mr. Hugo van den Broek, who has worked as a head coach and also is working as a head coach of middle distance running. He has earlier attached with Sai Bhopal also, but now also he is attached. He is going to present his topic on training mileage and intensity of distance running. Next, we have with us as guest appearance Srimati Jyotinmoy Shikdar, Padma Shri, Arjun Awardee and Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna Awardee in athletics. She got the most prestigious gold medal in Bangkok Asian Games in 1998 in the event 800 meter and 1500 meter. Madam, we welcome you. Next, we have with us Head of Tops, Sai New Delhi, Dr. Praloy Majumdar. Sir, we welcome you on this particular webinar. We have with us Dr. Kalyan Chaudhary, in charge academics, Sai NSCC, Kolkata. On behalf of Sports Authority of India and on my personal behalf, I welcome participants, all the eminent personalities in this prestigious webinar on high performance coaching. Before I introduce the speaker, may I request Srimati Jyotinmoy Shikdar to address the gatherings and the participants. Madam, please.
नमस्कार, हिंदी में बोलो ना बांग्लाते? हेलो?
Yes, madam. We can hear.
হিন্দিতে বল।
ठीक है। नमस्कार। आज का जो डिस्कशन है उसमें जो चीफ कोच है साइका कल्याणदा, अदर्स डिग्निटीज जो कोचेस है, सबका मेरा तरफ से अभिनंदन। एवं आज का जो डिस्कशन है मिडिल डिस्टेंस रनिंग का जो डिस्कशन में करते रहूं ना करो, तो जो माइलेज का बात है, मैं तो एक बताया मिडिल डिस्टेंस का रनर हूँ, गोल्ड मेडल मिला था मुझे 98 में 800-1500 मीटर में। मेरा जो एक्सपीरियंस है जो लॉन्ग डिस्टेंस का माइलेज के लिए, तो मुझे लगता है जे लॉन्ग डिस्टेंस के सबसे ज्यादा इंडोरेंस का ही जरूरत फर्स्ट, क्योंकि एक मकान बनाने के लिए उसका नीचे ही ज्यादा मजबूत करना जरूरत है। मिडिल डिस्टेंस के लिए भी सेम, सबसे पहले इंडोरेंस, उसके बाद तो पावर ट्रेनिंग है, स्पीड है। तो इंडोरेंस कैसे हम बढ़ाएंगे? तो मेरा एक्सपीरियंस है, मैं जब कोचिंग किया था इंडियन कोचेस का पास भी हूँ, फॉरेन कोचेस से भी मैंने ट्रेनिंग किया। तो 800 मीटर के लिए एक बार एक फॉरेन कोच मेरे को फर्स्ट टाइम जब ट्रेनिंग करने लगा, मेरे को बोला 20 किलोमीटर कंटिन्यूस रनिंग। तो मैंने सोचा 800 के लिए 20 किलोमीटर कंटिन्यूस रनिंग में कैसे करूं और कब मैं खत्म करूं? तो मेरा मन में ऐसे दिमाग में था, शायद मैं खत्म नहीं कर पाऊंगी इतना इंडोरेंस माइलेज। तो मेरे धीरे धीरे जैसे फर्स्ट दिन मुझे बहुत टाइम लगा, तो मैं मन में किया जे 20 किलोमीटर नेक्स्ट टाइम में इतना टाइम में क्या, सेकंड टाइम में इतना में मुझे आना चाहिए। तो ऐसे करते करते इंडोरेंस के लिए बढ़ाने के लिए एक तो कंटिन्यूस रनिंग का जरूरत, उसके साथ साथ में फार्डलेक का भी जरूरत। जैसे स्लो फास्ट है, ये तो कोचेस को भी ज्यादा मालूम होगा, हेड कोच है तो मेरा एक्सपीरियंस में ही बोल रहा है। और जैसे ऑफ सीजन के लिए इंडोरेंस के लिए ज्यादा जरूरत रिपीटेशन का। जैसे हम रिपीटेशन करेंगे 1000 मीटर रिपीटेशन हम कर रहे हैं, 10 रिपीटेशन करने से जैसे थोड़ा कम रेस्ट देके मैंने ऐसे ही किया था, 200 400 600 30 सेकंड रेस्ट लेके ज्यादा रिपीटेशन, इसमें इंडोरेंस ज्यादा बढ़ता है। 1 वीक में हम सोचेंगे 10 रिपीटेशन करेंगे 400, फिर नेक्स्ट वीक में हम सोचेंगे 12 करेंगे 14 करेंगे, करते माइलेज का हमारा धीरे धीरे बढ़ेगा। तो मेरा ख्याल से ही जो लॉन्ग डिस्टेंस मिडिल डिस्टेंस रनर है, इंडोरेंस का सबसे ही ज्यादा ये है, धीरे धीरे स्लो रनिंग करके इंडोरेंस बढ़ाना। उस इंडोरेंस का और आगे बढ़ाने के लिए रिपीटेशन का ज्यादा जरूरत है, पार्ट लेग का जरूरत है, उसके साथ साथ में वेट ट्रेनिंग, स्ट्रेचिंग, हर चीज अच्छा होगा तो तब माइलेज का इंडोरेंस धीरे धीरे आगे हम लेके जा सकता है। तो ये मेरा सुझाव है। और हेड कोच है कलंदा है, तो हम सोचेंगे जी हम ये जो डिस्कशन है, हम पूरा दुनिया हम झेल रहे हैं इस टाइम में कोरोना को लेके, जो खिलाड़ी से लेके हर क्षेत्रों में जो है बहुत मुश्किल में हम गुजर रहे। खास करके स्पोर्ट्समैन, ओलंपिक भी हमारा बंद हो गया। जो बच्चा लोग है उन लोग भी दिमाग में सोच रहे कब ऐसे लॉकडाउन खोलेगा, कोरोना जाएगा, हम पार्टिसिपेट करें, हम अच्छा ट्रेनिंग करें। ऐसे तो ऑनलाइन में ट्रेनिंग नहीं होता है, ऑनलाइन में थोड़ा सा पढ़ाई हो रहा है, बहुत मुश्किल में गुजर रहे हैं। हम सोचेंगे हम आगे हमारा जैसे फॉरेन कोच को भी लेके आए, फॉरेन डॉक्टर भी है, हमारा देश को आगे लेके जाने के लिए जो गांव का पहले भी डिस्कशन हुआ था रूरल एवं अर्बन को लेके। तो हम एक खिलाड़ी का नाते हम चाहेंगे ये जो डिस्कशन चल रहा है तो खिलाड़ी तक पहुंचे। तो कोचेस भी है, इन लोग मेरे से भी अच्छा सुझाव देंगे। डॉक्टर मजूमदार है, मजूमदार जब बेंगलोर में मैं रहती थी कैंप में, तो मुझे मालूम है, तो डर ही लगता था मशीन में जब चढ़ाती थी, तो जैसे गुड 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 बोल के ज्यादा और तेज रनिंग करके इंडोरेंस का इन लोग भी एक्सपीरियंस करता था कितना इंडोरेंस है। तो वो भी टेस्ट बहुत अच्छा लगता था। तो जो है सबको मेरे तरफ से अभिनंदन बोल के मैं अपना बात खत्म कर रही हूँ।
Thank you, madam. Thank you very much for your lovely speech and able motivations to our participants and the coaches.
Thank you.
Now it's a time to introduce today's speaker. It gives me an immense pleasure to introduce Mr. Hugo Nicolas van den Broek from Netherlands. Mr. Hugo Nicolas did it MSc in Human Movements Science and in Special Education in Child and Youth Psychology from Virge Universiteit. Mr. Vendroek is at present working as head coach of National Athletics Academy in India. Under his able leadership, that is between 2015 to 2020, our Indian team won a total of 101 national and international medals. From 2010 to 2013, he has worked as assistant coach of Gabriela Nicola, coach for a group of international Kenyan top athletes. So it will be a great opportunity for all of us to gather and enhance our knowledge for our future athletes. With this, I request Mr. Hugo Nicolas from Netherlands to present his topic on training mileage and intensity of distance running. Sir, we welcome you and request you to present your topic. Mr. Hugo Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Duta, for introducing me. Thank you, everyone, for having me on this seminar. I'm very honored to be here and talk to so many great coaches. I may have met some of you. I was at the Kalo India Games in January and in the cross-country championships the week after that. So I may have met some of you. Also, welcome to international viewers. I know there are some people watching through YouTube from other countries. Yeah, so today I will give you a presentation about training intensity. First, I will explain a little bit what training intensity actually is, and then we'll go a bit into the research that has been done, mostly with elite athletes, into what the best training intensity is, how you should basically what the best training practice is. And you might think, okay, this depends on the athlete, because of course every athlete is different, so every athlete needs different training, and that is partially true. But the interesting thing is that that is mostly on the details, whereas if you look at the bigger picture, you see a lot of similarities actually. So we're mostly going to talk about those similarities, and then I'll give you a little bit background about the science behind it, let's say the exercise physiology, what does it prove about the training methods, and after that we'll go into training, what do you say, periodization. So how do you divide the year into different periods based on those training intensities? Let me share with you my PowerPoint. I hope you can see it.
Yeah, we can see it. Hugo. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is our topic for today. What is the best training intensity distribution? First of all, about intensity zones. So when we talk about training intensity, what do we actually talk about? Training intensity basically comes down to how hard do you run. We have normally, if you look at science and also a lot of elite coaches, they use a system whereby they have 5 intensity zones. So this goes from zone 1 to zone 5, where zone 1 is easy running. Zone 3 is kind of marathon effort for elite athletes, let's say, or for at least for good runners. Zone 3 is marathon effort. If, let's say, you're running a marathon in faster than 3 hours. Zone 4 is considered roughly around the lactate threshold, or the pace you could do in a competition for about an hour. And then zone 5 is your 10K race pace and faster than that, 5K, 1500 meter pace, 800 meter pace. So those are the 5 different zones. In the middle, I've put a column with the heart rates. As you can see, I should add that that is just a rough indication. Yeah, so some athletes use a heart rate monitor to monitor their training and to kind of know in which intensity zone they are. Some don't. You can still use your intensity zones without using the heart rate monitor. But those percentages of maximum heart rate are kind of an indication. What you see when with a lot of well-trained athletes, for instance, if you look at zone 4, it says 88 to 93% of your maximum. So what does that mean? If your maximum heart rate is 200, that means you're anywhere between 176 and 186 in heart rate. And like I said, that is an indication. There are some athletes who will have slightly higher than that, and especially with amateur athletes, those who are beginning, they wouldn't be able to maintain that high heart rate. They might be at 85 or 80%, or maybe even 75% of their maximum heart rate. Yeah, but in general, with well-trained runners, this is a pretty good indication of where the heart rate zones will be. Now, those zones also give you a good indication of the training sessions that you would do. For example, zone 1 is used for easy running. Yeah, so that's roughly 60 to 72% of the maximum heart rate, can be a bit higher. For me personally, when I used to be a professional marathon runner, my zone 1 would be probably up to 77% of my maximum heart rate. Whereas with my zone 4, I was able to run a race for an hour, let's say a half marathon, at a heart rate of around 190, and that was 95% of my maximum. So, but I was a bit of an exception. So just to give you an indication that there can be some difference there. Generally, if you give an athlete a session like 20K or 80 minutes pace running, or tempo running, that's basically the same in India. We normally use the word pace running. That's generally done in zone 3. Yeah, if it's a good effort, so not easy, but if you say to an athlete, okay, we're going to do 80 minutes pace running, so hard effort, that's basically in zone 3. Sessions that you would do in zone 4 are when you do longer intervals, like 5 times 6 minutes with a 2 minutes jog recovery, or 5 times 7 minutes, 4 times 8 minutes. Most of the time, if you do a session in zone 4, that's a session that, let's say the quality part of the session lasts between 30 and 40 minutes. Sometimes it's like a non-stop effort, like a pace run, and sometimes it's with recovery in between, like 5 times 6, 5 times 7 minutes. And then zone 5 is everything, let's say all the track intervals where you run at your 5 to 10K pace or faster than that. So those intensity zones are used by scientists also a lot to kind of get an idea of what elite athletes do and what the best way of training is. Just a few notes about this. Some people use a 3-zone model. So if I go back to the previous one, in the 3-zone model, they take those zone 1 and 2 together. They call that easy running. Then they have zone 3, which they call it zone 2 in the 3-zone model. And then zone 3 in the 3-zone model is zone 4 and 5 taken together. So they have just 3 zones, which covers the same as those 5 zones. I find that only useful when you're dealing with amateur athletes. But when you're dealing with more professional athletes, you want to work with 5 zones because it's just, more nuanced. Second point I had already mentioned, the heart rate prescription is based on the average person. So it can be a bit different depending on the athlete. And you can still work with those zones if you don't work with heart rate. With my athletes in India, we unfortunately are not able to work with heart rate because we don't have enough heart rate monitors. We had 5, but they broke down, and now I think we have only 1 or 2, and we have 20 athletes. So we don't use the heart rate monitors, unfortunately. But I still base their training on those zones. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that intensity is not the same as effort. People sometimes confuse those two. Why is it not the same? Well, basically, you can have a hard workout in all of those zones. Maybe in zone 1 it's a little bit hard, but for example, if you look at zone 3, people would say like, okay, zone 3 is kind of moderate and zone 5 is hard. That's kind of true, but still you can do a very hard session in zone 3. You just have to run longer to make it hard. Just to give you an example, if you run zone 3, that's the pace you can probably do in a competition. If it was a really, like a maximum effort, you could do it for 2 hours, 2.5 hours. So if you do that pace in training for 20 minutes, that's not hard. That's not a hard effort. That's pretty comfortable. But if you continue that same pace for 90 minutes, that's a really hard training session. Yeah, so for instance, with our athletes, sometimes we do a 25K pace run, and that's almost all out for them in training. That's just a really hard effort. And the same is for if you look at zone 5. Let's say you do a session like 5 times 2K at your 10K race pace, or 6 times 1000 at your 3 to 5K race pace. That's a really hard effort. It's a really hard session. But you can also do 5 times 300 meters at your 3K race pace, which is not that hard, right? So those zones give you an idea of the effort, but it's not the same as effort. Now, we come to the actual research. Scientists have been looking for decades about what is the best way to train for distance athletes. And I mentioned here Stephen Seiler. You might want to Google him if you want to find out more about this research. Stephen Seiler is kind of the most well-known scientist when it comes to this type of research into intensity distribution. He is an American who lives in Norway, and he was on a training run himself. He was running, and he ran in the forest, and he saw a lady running in front of him. And he knew her because she had been tested in his lab, and he knew that she was a really good athlete. And he saw her, and he saw that she was walking up the hill. And he was wondering, like, why is she walking up the hill and she's so good? So he went to her and he asked her, why are you walking? And she said, today is supposed to be an easy session. I don't want to make it hard. So I walk up the hill to make sure that, I don't produce lactate, I don't make it hard for my muscles. And he thought it was very interesting. And, he got, it led to basically 2 things. First of all, he realized that she, and probably with her many top athletes, have a very high level of intensity discipline. Intensity discipline means that you don't run around like a dog, that if you see a rabbit, you start running fast, and if you're tired, you slow down. But you stick to the pace that you're supposed to do. And secondly, he realized that scientists had been looking for decades into what the best training was, but mostly they had been looking at amateur athletes, testing them in the lab, giving them a training session, seeing how it would improve their VO2 max or their running economy. And he said, that's not the right way. We should look at elite athletes because, for the last 100 years, athletes, world-class athletes and coaches have been looking for the best training practices. World records are broken every year or every few years. And definitely by now, elite athletes have the best idea of what works well and what doesn't. So they started doing studies into elite distance athletes, not just runners, but rowers, cross-country skiers, especially in Norway, they have a lot of good cross-country skiers, cyclists, swimmers. So they looked at all those distance athletes. And what was interesting, and I read most of that research, actually, there have been 20, 30 studies done into that. So if anyone would be interested, I can always send you that. What is interesting, actually, is that a similar pattern appeared from all those sports. And that is that in all those sports, whether it was swimming or cycling or running, those elite athletes will do lots of easy mileage, roughly 80% in their easy zones, so zone 1 and zone 2. And then most of them will do 2 to 3 hard workouts per week. And those 2 to 3 hard workouts per week would lead to approximately 20% in their high intensity zones. I call the zone 3, 4, and 5 the higher intensity zones. And those zones, zone 3, 4, and 5, are then used for the quality workouts. So if you would look at whether it was a swimmer or a runner or a cyclist at a world-class level, and some of those people had won Olympic medals or world championships, in general, you would see for some of them, their whole career, they would check 10, 15 years of training. They would do roughly 80% in zone 1 and 2, and a few harder workouts in zone 3 to 5 per week. So that was quite interesting for the scientists because they kind of expected to see that people would do more high quality training. So they were kind of surprised to see that there was so much easy mileage. One moment, just checking my notes a bit. Yeah. So, okay, so this is kind of a, how do you say, a graph of how, let's say, the average elite athlete would distribute his training or her training. And don't take this like it's always like this, but this is a good indication of how, you know, an average training week of an elite athlete would look like. And I've checked for my own athletes, and it's about the same. Not because I try my best to do it, you know, this way, but it's just you know, you make a training program, and in the end, if you look back and you start counting, yeah, it's about these percentages. So what you see is often between 60 and 70% in zone 1, 60 to 70% of training mileage. So when we are talking about an elite athlete, you talk about someone who runs around 150, 160 kilometers per week average, with maybe some weeks of 120 to 140K and some weeks of 200K. And of course, the total mileage depends on the person and depends on the event people do, because as Jyoti Moye also mentioned, you know, she was running 800, 1500. Of course, you're running less mileage compared to someone who runs a marathon or half marathon. But what you see with a lot of elite athletes, from especially 5K and longer, they're running around 160K per week. And then 60%, 65, 70% of that would be zone 1. So you're talking about almost 100K per week in the easy zone. Zone 2 still gets a considerable amount, around 15%. So if someone runs 15K per week, that's around 22K per week in that zone 2, which is kind of easy, but not that easy. It's still kind of a moderate pace. Then the quality sessions are in zone 3, 4, and 5. And what you often see is that there is a little bit more in zone 4. In this case, I put it at 10% because that's kind of average. And then about 5% in zone 3 and 5% in zone 5. What you see a lot is that, yeah, like I just mentioned, zone 4 gets relatively more attention than zone 3 and zone 5. And zone 4 is around the lactate threshold, or maybe slightly faster. So this is what you see a lot. So roughly 20% in those two zones combined. 20% seems little, but if you're running 160K per week, 20% is still 32 kilometers per week in the higher intensity zone. So that's not really very little. Yeah, so this is basically a summary of the most important findings of that research into the elite athletes, that there's a large amount of easy training. I write not too easy, I'll go back to that later. The quality workouts in zone 3, 4, and 5, and what you see is that there's a lot of variation. So unlike some people say, like, okay, we should only focus on zone 4, only focus on zone 5, you don't really see that. When you look at elite athletes, you see continuously variation, where every month, if you would look at the month of training, they never leave out any of those zones. There's always something in zone 3, always something in zone 4, and always something in zone 5. You do see that there's more emphasis on certain zones in certain parts of the year, and we'll go back to that later. You see that zone 4 often gets a little bit bigger share than zone 3 and 5. And well, other things that are important is that, of course, there are differences between athletes. And I especially mention this because what you hear now sometimes, and this is also partially due to this scientist, Stephen Seiler. He has done great research, but he appears in a lot of podcasts and YouTube videos where I feel like maybe he's trying to commercialize it a bit. So he's trying to make it a little bit dogmatic, like as if, you know, it should be 80-20. So they call it the 80-20 method, or polarized training. If you Google on polarized training, you'll find a lot. But it's not as strict as they sometimes present. I've seen even, I've heard podcasts with Seiler where he says that zone 4 is a sweet zone and you should do most of your training in zone 4, so around the lactate threshold. And you should, he claims that elite athletes ignore zone 3 That's not the case. I mean, I've read all his research and all the research from other scientists into this area, and that's definitely not the case. Coaches and athletes pay attention to all those different zones, and the quality sessions are definitely done in zone 3, 4, and 5 in all of these zones. They don't ignore anything. So if you go and read some stuff about this, don't believe the dogmatic things. So you sometimes see people going to the extreme where they say, we should only train in this zone and we should ignore that, and that's not happening. So you see that some athletes, those who are a little bit maybe more fast twitch type of athletes, they tend to go more into the distribution where 70-75% is in the easy zones, and then the remaining 25 to 30% is higher quality. And some others where you see that they are doing more like 90% zone 1, so relatively more in the easy zones, and only 10% the higher quality zones. So some differences there, and you see also differences within the year for for the same athlete. So if you look at one athlete, the training intensity doesn't have the same distribution throughout the year. We'll talk about that later. But I wanted to mention about not too easy. First point, when I first came in India, December 2014 and 2015, started working with my athletes, I felt like many of them were running too slow. They were doing their easy runs at 5 minutes per K, and their race pace would be around 3 minutes per K. So I felt like there was a very big difference, and they were used to that. They were basically jogging slowly at a pace that would be okay for an amateur runner, but not for our athletes. So I kind of gave them, I made a calculation based on their lactate threshold. So what we did is we did a 30-minute time trial or pace run, where they would run for 30 minutes on the track, not completely all out, but a very hard effort. And the pace they would run there, I would calculate 75 to 85% of that pace, and that should be the pace for their easy training. So to give you an example, someone who, like some of the guys would run their threshold during that 30-minute pace run, they would run a pace of 3 minutes and 10 seconds per K. That's 19 K per hour. So if you calculate 75 to 85%, you come to around 4 minutes and 10 seconds and 3 minutes and 45 seconds per K. So that would be the pace I prescribe them for their easy training, between 4:15 and 3:45. That's roughly their zone 1. And I felt like if they go slower than that, so at 70-60% of their threshold, then it was really too slow. That would be okay, for warm up and cool down. And even if they have done a very hard workout in the morning, and then in the afternoon they jog slowly for 30 or 40 minutes, then I wouldn't mind so much about the pace. If they want to go really slow because it's all about the recovery, it's okay. But then the next morning, if they would just go for a regular 1-hour run, I would give them that pace prescription, basically, otherwise, to make sure that they wouldn't go too slow. Now we go to what does science tell us about this training method. This is just a picture. I wanted to include a picture, so I thought, let me put a picture of a mitochondria. So for some of you, you may know this, others may not. So let me explain a little bit. Inside our cells, inside all our cells, or almost all our cells, we have mitochondria. Mitochondria are basically the powerhouses of our cell. They are like little fabrics that help us to produce energy. So they take our food and they take oxygen, they absorb that, and they turn that into ATP or energy. Mitochondria are absolutely essential for athletes and for all athletes, for everyone. I mean, if we don't have mitochondria, we can't live. But normal people, they can do with the mitochondria that they have. But when you're a distance athlete, you want to have as much of those mitochondria as possible and you want them to work really well because they really help you in producing all the energy that you need to run fast. So what does physiology tell us? I mentioned there the name of David Bishop because he's one of the guys. He's a scientist, an exercise physiologist from Australia, who has done a lot of research into what training does on a muscular level. And the interesting thing is that this is completely in line with what we see how elite athletes train. And this is interesting because most elite athletes don't train this way. They have not trained this way for decades because they know the science. They have found out by themselves how to train well based on decades of training experience from other elites, their own experience. But physiology really backs this up because what does physiology show us is that when you take an athlete and you increase the mileage of that athlete, whether it's in cycling or in running or swimming, in general, you see that the body starts to produce more mitochondria. So you get more of those little powerhouses in your muscle cells. And this amount of mitochondria can double based on increasing your mileage. What you also see is an increase in capillarization. Capillarization, that means that basically the tiny blood vessels in your muscles. You can imagine, like when you're not an athlete, of course we all have blood vessels that bring the blood to our muscles, and yeah, we all need that to live. But when we're athletes and we work really hard, it helps us to have more of those blood vessels, and especially the tiny blood vessels that lead to all the different places in the muscles. If we have more of that, then it becomes easier for our body to bring oxygen to our muscles. Yeah, so science has found that an increase in mileage leads to more mitochondria and more increase of capillarization. So basically what that means is that our body becomes very efficient in bringing oxygen to the muscle cells and then using that oxygen to produce the energy that we need. And the funny thing is also that according to Bishop, at least, there has not been shown any ceiling to this. So in other words, an increase in mileage so far seems always to produce more mitochondria. So if you run 160K per week and you go to 180K or you go to 200K per week, still your body will produce more mitochondria and increase the capillarization. Of course, there is a limit to what everyone can handle, right? So if, like in my own case, I used to run in my peak years, probably running around 160 to 180K per week. And I would sometimes have a week of 200K, but I could not do 5 weeks of 200K in a row because it would exhaust me. I would get overtrained. When you get overtrained, all the mitochondria cannot help you because you are just exhausted and your body will not recover and you're not going to perform well. So of course there's a maximum to what athletes can handle. But if your body can handle it, an increase in mileage seems to work all the time. And then the second thing that science shows us is that high intensity sessions seem to work much better in improving the mitochondria function. So what that means is that although an increase in mileage gives you more mitochondria, it doesn't really help you that much in improving the function of the mitochondria, so how efficient they work. The high intensity sessions do that. So those sessions in zone 3, 4, 5, let's say around 90% of your maximum heart rate or your VO2 max, around 90% of that effort or faster, that provides the kind of stimulus that makes your mitochondria to work better. Yeah, so that's why you need this combination. So basically what you see is that physiology confirms what athletes do, namely that you need a combination of, on the one hand, the mileage, and on the other hand, the high intensity sessions. If you would do 5 high intensity sessions a week, you wouldn't be able to have high mileage. If you do only high mileage and you don't do any high intensity sessions, you're not going to get there also. So you really need that combination of high mileage and 2 or 3 high intensity sessions a week. And that doesn't mean that there's no single week where you can do 4 high intensity sessions or even 5. You can, but in general, throughout the year, if you look at the average, what athletes can handle for a longer period of time without getting overtrained, that's roughly 2 to 3 sessions per week at high intensity. And finally, the last thing is also important, what physiology, what it looks like now if you read and listen and talk with physiologists, is that athletes actually need the mileage, the easy mileage, to be able to handle high intensity sessions well and to respond to that. Because we know, of course, that if you do a hard workout, the hard workout only makes you better because you recover from it, and it improves your level. So you, if you know, for example, if you have someone who runs 30-40K per week, that athlete, if you give that athlete a session of 10 times 1000 hard, that might be too hard for such an athlete to handle. They might be able to do the session but not recover well from it, and it wouldn't really make them better. And that's what high mileage does. It kind of provides a very strong base. It provides like a foundation on top of which you can build the house. So you can imagine, I often see training as a way of building a house or building a flat. If you want to build a bungalow with 1 story, you don't need a very hard foundation. Yeah, you can make a simple foundation because you just have 1 story, 1 floor on it. But if you want to take athletes, prepare athletes for Olympics, it means you have to build a flat of 10 stories high. And to be able for that flat to stand well, you need a very strong foundation. And that strong foundation is made of high mileage. Not only high mileage, also strength training and some hill work, but high mileage is a very important component of it. And on top of that high mileage, you can then build the walls of the building, which are the higher quality and the specific sessions. If you don't have that strong foundation, you wouldn't be able to build very good walls. You can give some quality sessions, but the athletes will never be able to handle what needs to be done to make it to the Olympic level. This one, so if you have backup from science, from sports science, if you're working with sports scientists, these are some of the things you can look at. The 3 most important determinants of endurance performance according to physiologists. So in other words, the 3 things that kind of need to be improved in order to improve your distance performance. That is VO2 max, or in other words, maximum oxygen consumption. Maximum oxygen consumption is a good marker for how much energy you're able to produce to run. And then secondly, your lactate threshold. I don't have too much time to go very deep into lactate threshold, but basically what your lactate threshold is that the faster you run, the more lactate you produce, but your body is also continuously consuming lactate. So this is like they call it a lactate shuttle. Yeah. So if you measure, let's say now in daily life, I would take a blood sample of myself and measure my lactate. I might see 1.5 millimole or 2 millimole. And if I start running, probably it will first go down a little bit, and then it will go up and start to rise. 3 millimole, 4 millimole, 5 millimole. The actual amount that you find in your blood is lower than what you produce, because from all the lactate that your body produces, you constantly consume again about 75 to 80%. 75 to 80% of all the lactate that you produce is absorbed by your brain, your liver. It's turned into glycogen. It's absorbed by your muscles, especially by your muscles. They use the lactate as a form of energy. So it's wrong to think about lactate as something that's bad and we don't need it. We do. It's probably our most important form of energy. So now your lactate threshold is the level where you're still producing as much lactate as you're consuming. So if you run at your lactate threshold, you can kind of run for a long time in a competition for about 1 hour, because your lactate levels are not going to rise all the time. Whereas if you go slightly faster than your lactate threshold, now you come to your 10K race pace or your 5K race pace, what you see is that if you run the same pace, but your lactate levels are continuously going up, because your body is not able to consume enough of the lactate to keep it constant. You're producing. So that is something that can be measured, can be tested, and it's a very important marker for endurance performance. And then finally, running economy. That's also important. Running economy shows you the amount of oxygen that you use at a given speed. So where you want VO2 max to be as high as possible, because you want to be able to produce, you want to be able to consume a lot of oxygen when you're running as fast as possible. But you want your running economy to be low. Why do you want it to be low? Let's say now you're able to consume 80 milliliters per kg body weight per minute. But if you're running at a submaximal speed, so let's say your marathon pace, it's an advantage when you can do that on a low amount of oxygen. So these are things you can test. What we saw, for instance, with there's a nice study about Paula Radcliffe, the former world record holder on the marathon. She hardly improved her VO2 max in her career, but she improved a lot in her running economy. And this is where high mileage works. So high mileage especially works on improving your running economy and improving your lactate threshold. Whereas the high quality sessions, they work more on improving your VO2 max, also your lactate threshold, but less on the running economy. Although, it's not exactly true. You do need, you want to be also, economical at your race pace. So let's say when you're a 1500 meter runner, in order to get economical at your 1500 meter race pace, you have to do some sessions at that speed also, so that your body gets comfortable at that speed and then basically starts to use less oxygen for running the same speed. Now, next subject. We go to periodization. Periodization talks about, well, I think you all know, but dividing the year in different periods based on getting you ready for races. So how do you periodize your training? Now we're looking at those training intensities. I use the method that's also used by two kind of famous coaches. Renato Canova, he's an Italian coach. He's a lot with me here in Kenya. In case you didn't know, I mean, I live in Kenya and broadcasting now from Kenya. So Renato Canova is an Italian coach that works with a lot of Olympians, and he's often here. Steve Magnus is an American coach who has a website called scienceofrunning.com. For those of you who are running coaches, you may want to check that website. It's really interesting. So their philosophy, and I work in the same way, is that if you prepare an athlete for a race, when you're 3, 4, 5 months out from that race, you work on, especially on paces that are much faster than your race pace and much slower than your race pace. And as you approach the race, you start to focus more on the specific sessions. This is a bit different from 30, 40 years ago, how athletes used to do it, because before they mostly used to focus on slower than race pace, so the bottom of this graph, and then work their way up. Now we work most on both sides. So what does this mean? If you're a 5,000 meter runner, it's 4 or 5 months before your competition, you work on your mileage, you work on your zone 3, so your longer pace runs. So you create that base on the aerobic side of it. And on the faster side, you work on strength training and you do hill sprints. For instance, we do hill sprints where you go 10 seconds up, sprint all out up the hill, take a 2-minute break, and you repeat that 5 or 10 times. And Yeah, so you work on both sides, a bit faster than race pace and slower than race pace. You will still do something at your race pace. If you're a 5K runner, you may do some 400-meter reps at your 5K race pace. So it wouldn't be really hard. You wouldn't do very long, exhausting sessions at your race pace, but you will just touch that race pace a bit now and then, but you will focus a bit more on the speed. You might do some sessions in your 1500-meter race pace or 800-meter race pace, and you will focus on building your mileage, your quality endurance sessions like your zone 3 and zone 4. Now, as you approach the race, you start to work more on the specifics. So in the last months before the race, you work on your race pace and you support your race pace with normally paying attention to the events that are, let's say, one higher and one lower. So for a 5K runner, you will also pay attention to 10K race pace on the slower side, and you will pay attention to 3K or 1500-meter race pace on the faster side. That's where your focus is. At the same time, you'll never forget also your zone 3 and your zone 4. So throughout the year, you pay attention to everything. The difference is more what you emphasize a bit more. So here, summarize, like when you're in the early preparation period or the base period, we call it a base phase. This is for track athletes. I didn't write for marathon runners. Marathon runners, it's a little bit different. But for track athletes, you always want a very large amount of variation in the base period because this really helps you to create a good base. Increasing mileage is important. Zone 3 sessions are really important for long-term development. They call these developmental sessions. So you, like research has also shown, when you take amateur athletes or even well-trained athletes and you let them do zone 3 sessions, they normally don't improve as much as when you let them do zone 4 sessions. Zone 4 sessions seem to have a more short-term effect, but athletes and coaches, elite athletes and world-class coaches, they all agree that zone 3 sessions are still very important, but they're more developmental. So they're really important for creating that strong base. Then zone 4 is always important in every phase, actually. And zone 5 sessions, you would do them, but you would do relatively short intervals. So you don't make it very exhausting. You will do some sprints or hill sprints. And we normally do a lot of strength training and circuit training. So with our athletes in Bhopal, for instance, we normally have at least 3 times a week where we have a strength component. Even now they're at home, of course, because of Corona. So I give them 2 circuit sessions a week. The circuit session has some core exercises, but also a lot of exercises for the legs, for the hamstrings, for the glutes, and they do about 40 minutes of such a circuit. So it's pretty heavy, and they do that twice a week. And next to that, they still do also hill sprints, which are also great for strength. So we do work on that strength component, and of course the mileage. For my athletes, I calculated now they're about, for the junior athletes, they're at roughly 85 to 15%. So that means for them, it's about 85% of easy mileage. So for someone who runs 100K per week, that's about 85 kilometers is easy, and then around 15 kilometers is quality, zone 3, 4, and 5. When we go to the specific period, so this is now the last, can be the last 6 weeks or the last 10, 12 weeks before a race. Because how long that specific period lasts depends a bit on the athlete. Some athletes need a longer specific period to get ready for races. You may still do some of those zone 3 sessions, but it's watered down. So that means it's reduced, it's not as long, it's not as heavy, and not as often. Zone 4 sessions depend a bit on the event and the runner. When you're a 10K runner, you really have to pay attention to your zone 4 because it's very close to your 10K race pace. When you're an 800-meter runner, you can do a bit less of it. And the focus is definitely more on zone 5, which is your race pace, and also one event longer and one event shorter than that. When you're in the specific period, you want to increase the length of the intervals, of course. So to give you an example, for a 5,000-meter runner, you would, in the base period, you could do a session like 20 times 400 meters at your 5K race pace with maybe a minute rest. it sounds tough, but that's not that tough for a well-trained athlete. Now, when you approach the race, you are going to do 600 meter reps, 800 meter reps, 1K reps. You can think of something like 6 times 1000. We give sometimes 3 or 4 sets of 2 times 1000. So you run longer intervals at your race pace. It's much harder. You need a bit more recovery between the intervals. And finally, you can even do longer intervals like 3 times a mile at your 5K race pace. So that's really a way to make it very specific, to make it look more like the competition. You will still do some maximum sprints for the track athletes. This is not important if you're a marathon runner or a half marathon runner. You may want to do some, when you're a really long distance runner, you may do some 200 or 300 meter repetitions sometimes to work on your speed, but not really maximum sprints. But I believe that when you're a track athlete, you really want to maintain your maximum sprinting power, because you also need that in the last lap. You know, the last lap is often decided on less than a second. So we do work on sprints, and also specifically finishing sprints, and we still do weights and plyometrics. The tapering period, so this is the last few weeks before the race when you're getting ready. Most important is to reduce your mileage. How much you reduce your mileage depends a bit on the athlete. Science, if you look at the science behind it, they say often you can reduce the mileage with 50%. I find that a lot. I find that it does work with a little more fast twitch athletes. So let's say those who are like the shorter distance type, 800, 1500 meter. When you work with longer distance athletes, for most of them, we reduce the mileage maybe 20%, maybe 30%, but not much more than that. So if someone used to run 120K per week, now they may go to 90K per week or something, but they still have good amount of mileage, because if we reduce it too much, they don't feel comfortable with that. What is especially important is that you reduce the length of the workouts. So when you're tapering, instead of reducing the number of training sessions or reducing the pace of the sessions, that doesn't seem to work very well. Instead, what we do is we make every session short. So instead of doing 10 times 1000, we may now do 8 times 600, but at the same speed or maybe slightly faster. Yeah, we take a little bit more recovery between the repetitions. Yeah, so that's the main point. Sorry, about tapering is we continue with the same number of sessions, or we may reduce from 11 sessions a week to 9 or 10, but it's not a big difference. The main difference is in making the sessions shorter. And then, yeah, what for me is very important is mental preparation for a race. I don't go deep into that now. That can talk about that for 2 hours, but mental preparation is extremely important. Visualization and athletes having race strategies, and, going to the race in your head and preparing yourself, giving yourself confidence, increasing your focus is extremely important for good performance. And then saving energy. So saving energy, I try always to teach my athletes always in the last weeks, and also when they go to the race, to save as much energy as possible. Don't go around, and now that you train a bit less, you have more energy, so you want to go and visit your friends and go to parties. No, that's not the case, and they should save their energy and prepare mentally for the race. We're almost at the end, so when we talk about a systematic approach to training, or a little bit scientific approach to training, what I like to do is keeping data about the intensity that my athletes do. I'll show you an example in the last sheet. So basically what you do is you keep track of how much they run in each zone. And then when you do tests, like once a month, we do a time trial, or we do a 30-minute pace run, or we do some sprints, you can see how they develop. You can see how they improve, if they improve or if they not improve. And you can compare that with the intensity they've been training, right? In the last months, in the last year, you can see what they respond to, if they respond well to the training or not so much. And And if possible, you can also get scientific support to test the VO2 max, lactate levels, threshold, and running economy. Yeah, this is the last sheet, I think. Yeah, this is one of the girls in our team, actually 18-year-old girl. She, this year in January, she won gold in Kalo India in the 1500. She ran for 22 and qualified for the World Junior Championships. So this is an example of 5 of her weeks of training, about 1 month. 9 December is about 1 month, I think, or 5 weeks before Kalo India. So this is what I do of all my athletes, or all my important athletes. I keep track of how much they run in each zone. So to give you an example, if we look at the first week of 11 November, she ran 112K in total. From that 112K, 89K was easy, and 5K in zone 2. That's probably that 5K in zone 2, that must be that I told her, like, okay, today, this morning, 60 minutes easy, but the last 20 minutes, you go a little bit moderate. Then she would go from 420 per K, accelerate to 4 minutes per K. So that 5K is then zone 2. That's not yet her marathon pace, but a little bit faster. And then she did a total of 18K in the higher quality zones. As you can see, 18K in zone 3, 4, and 5. And if you look at the other weeks, every week it's about 15 to 18 kilometers in those higher intensity zones. So that's pretty constant, and it's normally of around 100K or a bit more. So as you can see, that's about 15% of the total mileage in zone 3, 4, and 5. And yeah, keeping those data gives you a very good idea later if you want to look back and you want to evaluate the training. You want to see, like, hey, how did my athlete actually train? Of course, you can go through the training program, and of course, you have to still keep all the training programs. Like, okay, what kind of workouts did she actually do? And so that's still important, but still, this graph can also give you a lot of information to see, how much did paying more attention to 10K and 5K pace. And as you can see also in the yellow part, I've added in yellow, more specified from the zone 5. So this is part of zone 5. How much of the zone 5 training was in 10 to 5K pace and how much was in 3K pace to 1500 meter pace. So those 2 numbers in yellow should add up to be the same in zone 5. As you can see here, in the first week, she did 8K in zone 5. From that 8K, 6K was in her 10 to 5K pace, and 2K was in her 3K to 1500 meter pace. And so as you can see here, in the beginning, she did more in her 10 to 5K pace, which is kind of, we call it aerobic support for her 1500 meters. So these are sessions like 6 to 8 times 1000 meters with maybe 90 seconds recovery, or 20 times 400 with a 1 minute recovery at a 5K pace. And as you see, as she comes closer to the race, it starts to shift, and she did more in her 3K to 1500 meter pace. So it became more specific, where she started focusing more on her 1500 meter speed and did a bit less in the 5 to 10K speed. So I keep this throughout the year for all my important athletes, and I feel like it really helps to structure the training and to look back and see, okay, what worked and what didn't work. And if next time she has a bad race, or I see that there's lack of improvement, we can go back and see, like, hey, maybe she did too much in zone 5, or maybe, we focused a bit too much on zone 3 and we ignored in zone 4. So yeah, this is a way of analyzing your training. That was it. Thank you very much. I think I've stayed within 1 hour.
Yeah, sure.
Can I close it?
Yeah, sure. That was a nice session from your part. Now, I request Dr. Pralay Majumdar. Dr. Pralay Majumdar is there? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Pralay Majumdar is there online?
Yes, sir, he is there.
Yeah. Sir, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, sir. Sir, I request you to summarize this session now, because it is already regarding the physiology. So I think you are the most appropriate person to summarize the session. So please.
Hi, Hugo.
Hello.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful listening to you, listening from you about the distance. What are the different physiological aspect as well as the training aspect of handling the distance group. The takeaway of this, the entire whatever you have spoken is basically the athlete should, it depend on the physical attribute of the athlete and the capacity of the athlete based on the capacity, based on the physiological quality. We have to design the program and concentrate on basically on 5 different segments of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. As Mr. Hugo has suggested that we need to concentrate more on 1, 2, and 3. If it's a percentage wise, the 70 to 75%, the athlete concentrate on 1, 2, and 3, and 20 to 25% on 3 and 4 and 5 zone, as you have suggested. But my thing is, I just wanted to know from you that when you concentrate on, when you are giving the training on this 3, 4, and 5, the athlete should have the capacity to tolerate that particular load, keeping him within the zone in a sense that they should not produce more than the required lactate, which is essentially for around 5 to 6 millimole, which is called the mixed zone. Because if it is more than that, then again it will cause a lot of acidosis and the recovery would be delayed. So I just wanted to know from Hugo that what would be the concern for how you will tackle that problem when you are giving the load for, if you wanted to develop the zone 4 and 5 for the Indian athlete, where they are not within the zone in terms of lactate and heart rate. So how you manage that? Can you specify that, please?
Yes, that is a very good point, Dr. Majumdar. Thank you very much. You're right. The basic takeaway message for me is that people should focus on 2 to 3 quality workouts in zone 3, 4, and 5. And next to that, create a huge base by doing 85% of training in the easier zones. And the reason I'm mentioning that also is that, I see some coaches that, not in India specifically, but everywhere, that think like, okay, mileage is not important. 4, 5, 6 quality sessions a week are more important. You really don't see any scientific backup for that. You know, it might work for a few rare individuals, but in general, it's really a large aerobic base that's really important. So, and it's kind of contradicting. People sometimes don't understand it because they say, hey, these people in competition, they run 20K per hour, 3 minutes per K. So why would they run more than 100K per week? So slow, you know, in like 15K per hour or 16K per hour, which is much slower than their race pace. Well, as you said, science has provided the answer for that. It really helps in producing more mitochondria and capitalization. So it is that combination. Now, to go to your question, how do you tackle the issue of making sure they stay within the zones? I can say 2 things about that. And the first of all is that it's difficult because we don't have scientific support, unfortunately, and we don't have much budget. So I wish I could do lactate testing. I really wish for me that was something that if I had a budget of a few €1,000 per year, because normally one test costs like €2.50 or so. So in rupees, I'm not sure, it's maybe 200 rupees, 300 rupees for one test. And normally when you do a training session, you want to take a few blood samples, so maybe 3, 4, or 5. So you'll be spending maybe close to 1,000 rupees for one athlete. And then if you want to do that with 10 athletes, that's a lot of money just for one training session, right? So I wish we had a budget to do frequent, or let's say at least once or twice a month, lactate testing, so that we could check that. I agree with you that that's a point where you can it can help you to keep the intensity good. So what I have to do is I have to go by feeling, by looking at my athletes, by listening. You can, apart from lactate, of course, you can listen to the ventilation. How hard does someone breathe? And it seems, of course, less scientific, but it still works pretty well. Where if you see athletes who can breathe 2 steps in, 2 steps out, so when you're running, then I know it's kind of in control. And whereas if they start breathing fast, then I know that, okay, this is not good. And I see with some of the athletes who are a little bit more the fast twitch type athletes, they tend to go over the edge. So what I would do then, I would give them a shorter recovery. That sounds a little bit, how do you say, maybe counter to what you would expect. Because you would think like, oh, if they're going too fast, they need a longer recovery. But we do the opposite, because with those kind of athletes, if you give a longer recovery, they always push themselves to zone 5 instead of staying in zone 4. So if you do a session like 5 times 6 minutes, and there's a 3-minute jog recovery, and I see that, hey, these athletes are going too fast, then I tell them next time we do 7 minutes with only a 1 or 2 minutes jog recovery, and then I know they will stay in the zone. Because there's no way they can go to zone 5 and maintain that training. And of course, we measure the speed when they run. So that is something, at least we have GPS watches. So when they run, not on the track, but I often prefer they run on a trail. We have a nice trail in Bhopal, or they go on the road. We measure with GPS the speed. And if an athlete is able to maintain that session, the same speed, or maybe accelerate a little bit in the last repetition, then I know they're staying in the right zone, because it's not possible to go to zone 5 without dropping the speed.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Hello.
Yes.
One aspect of looking for training for the endurance group, it is very difficult to take everybody into one group, because the physical quality or physical attribute of different athletes would be different. Because if the zone 1, if the zone 3 and zone 4, if somebody is in the zone 3, the other person may be in the zone 4. So that kind of thing also in a group training, it would be relatively difficult to maintain a group training, rather than the program should be tailor-made for the athlete, individual athlete.
5 programs, I divide them in groups, and then even within these programs, there are sometimes differences where I say, okay.
So one of the aspects, the most of the scientists, they are relying on that particular thing, where the lactate production, even for 85-90% of your maximum heart rate, it should not produce more than 1 millimole. So the previous speed maybe 6. If the next load is 7, then that can be considered that still they can tolerate that. That is called MLSS instead of calling them threshold. So
Right.
MLSS is much more easier or much more better indicator for the success of endurance runner now these days.
Yeah. Now I agree with you actually also that even the term lactate threshold, of course, is a little bit controversial, because when you look, you test the athletes, you do not always see a threshold in a way that it's suddenly going up. So it's better to talk about maximal lactate steady state, XLAS or MLSS. I agree with that. Yeah, and I would love to work with you or with another sports scientist in testing those things with our athletes, because I feel like it can help.
It would be always we are very fortunate to work with the team, and the Bangalore's we have done that, and possibly Bhopal also. We are in a process of recruiting more number of scientists, and more number of equipment would be available in Bhopal when you will come back. So it's a wonderful presentation, Hugo. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before I wind up, Mr. Hugo, It's a wonderful sessions from your part. Actually, the way you have expressed the things, especially I like the way you told
So,
how to know. Yeah,
so
yeah.
just intervening for 1 minute. So there's a question that has come on YouTube. Someone is asking, marathon training, should I increase the length of intervals and reduce the number per training session?
Can you put the questions? Can you put the question? Hugo, there is one question is there before I wind up from in the
Yeah.
YouTube. Just listen.
Okay.
Yeah, Hugo, there's a question that's come on YouTube live. So the question is, for marathon training, should I increase the length of intervals and reduce the number per training session?
Yeah, when you're training for marathon, so when it's a little bit different for marathon training compared to track training. When you are in your base period for a marathon runner, you want to pay more attention to your threshold, zone 4 and zone 5, especially zone 5, increasing your VO2 max and working more on the faster paces. And then when you're in the specific period for the marathon, so let's say the last 10 weeks, you want to focus more on marathon pace. So yeah, it depends on the athlete, but with elite marathon runners, we do sessions. It may sound hard, but marathon is hard anyway. So we do sessions like 5 times 5K at marathon speed with only a 2-minute recovery. Which we build up from 4 times 4K to 4 times 5K and then 5 times 5K and sometimes also 4 times 7K after that. So you have long intervals, long sessions. And sometimes it's true that when you're training for the marathon, you actually do less sessions because the sessions that you do are so long. So you can imagine if you do a session of 30 kilometers in the morning, you may not have to do another 10K in the afternoon, but you just take a rest or you cycle a bit or you swim a bit. And then the next day you may have 2 easy sessions the next 2 days before you have another quality workout. So yeah, sometimes for the marathon, of course, the mileage is high, but the number of sessions is not necessarily more and sometimes even less compared to track athletes because you have such long sessions.
Right, right. Thank you, Mr. Hugo. The way you have expressed the things, it's very easy for us to understand also. And especially, I like the way you told about the practical part, how you understand that whether he is very much tired or not. To know about the breathing part, that is very important. As a coach, we should know. Anyway, sir, we are happy to mention our obligations and to you for your detailed explanation of the topic, training mileage and intensity of distance running. It's a wonderful presentation. The way you have biparted that periodization part, that is also very useful for our coaches. And I request before I finish up about you, I request you to share your that PPTs to us so that it can be distributed to the coaches also. Okay. Then
Sure.
uh, we remain very much obliged to Srimati Jyotinmay Sikdar, Padma Shri, Arjun Awardee, and Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna Awardee for addressing the gatherings and expressing his views to all of us. Thank you, madam, for your presence. I'd like to thank to Dr. Praloy Majumdar, head of the TOPS I New Delhi, to summarize the sessions. And he is an eminent person in the field of physiology. We all know. Thank you, sir, for your guidance and the support. We are very much obliged the way you are helping us. We express our gratefulness to Dr. Kalyan Chaudhary, in charge academics, for his able leaderships to organize this type of webinars. Sir, we are very much thankful. Never to forget, we convey our gratefulness to all the participants from all sports fraternities who have participated here and were present to hear this wonderful lecture. Once again, I thank you on and all. Thank you. Have a good day.